speech will be about the future of the climate change and clean energy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with a big round of applause.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great pleasure to be with you this morning and to join this wonderful array of speakers that we've had both yesterday and today. I want to add my congratulations to the Seoul Economic Daily. This is really quite an extraordinary event that you've organized here, and I really want to congratulate you on your first 50 years of successful work and look forward to the next 50 ahead. I want to focus today on what I think is really going to be a critical set of constraints facing the global economy as we move forward in this century and beyond. The challenge has been touched on by some of the previous speakers, but I think this is an opportunity to get into much greater depth on some of the challenges that Korea will be facing along with the rest of the world. And our challenge today is that we have really had an economic model, a very successful economic model that has really transformed the world in the last century, has greatly raised living standards, but unfortunately that economic model has been one that I think is not going to be successful going forward in the new century. And the problem is that it is essentially an economic model based on very, very inefficient use of energy, one throughput use of resources so that we really have a throwaway economy where we dig things up out of the ground or cut them down, transform them into useful products for a short period of time, and then simply dispose of them. That is a model that has worked rather well when we had just a few 100 million people in the world that were aspiring to modern lifestyles and to have all of the kinds of amenities that we're becoming used to in today's world. But of course now we are experiencing a true economic transformation where the majority of the world's population, populations measured not in the hundreds of millions but in the billions, are now moving into this modern industrial era. The emergence not only of China and India, the two largest countries in the world in terms of population, with between them 40% of the world's population, 2.5 billion people, but of course many more countries as well throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And I think it is abundantly clear, no matter which resource system you look at, that the economic model that we have in place today is simply not going to work for a world of 8 to 9 billion people aspiring to live in the way that Americans or Europeans or many Koreans live today. Just one very, very simple example of that. The world today uses about 80 million barrels of oil a day. If China were to use as much oil per person as Japan currently uses, which is about half as much as the United States, you would have to double world oil production just to meet the needs of China, let alone, of course, the emergence of India and other developing countries around the world. So you could conceivably have to increase world oil production by a factor of 3 to 4 if we were to really have the kind of oil-based transportation system that we're used to having in many industrialized countries, and to replicate that on a global scale. Well, of course, the problem is that there is not a geologist on the planet who thinks that we're ever going to see a doubling, let alone a tripling or quadrupling of world oil production. And in fact, world oil production is likely to peak at no more than 90 million barrels per day within the next decade, according to most experts. So by definition, if we're going to have a sustainable global economy to provide the kind of mobility, the kind of transportation systems, let alone heating, cooling, air conditioning, modern industrial products to billions of people around the world, we're going to have to do it in a very different way than we currently do it. And of course, beyond the limits imposed by oil resources, we face the much more profound limits in terms of the health of our biological systems, the availability of our mineral resources, but most importantly in terms of the ability of the atmosphere itself to absorb all of the carbon dioxide that is being produced by today's energy systems. While the transformation of the world to deal with these kinds of challenges is going to involve everything from culture to government policy to changes in technology, it is ultimately also a profound economic transformation that we are going to have to face up to. The kind of economic structures, the kind of industries that we have in place today are not only going to have to be transformed, they're going to have to be transformed exceedingly rapidly in ways that indeed will reshape the future of the next generation. Now, there's a lot of focus in capitals around the world on the substantial costs of making this transition, and understandably there is a lot of concern and a lot of resistance both by industries and also on the part of labor unions about the kinds of very substantial costs and potential disruption from changes that are this dramatic. And we see that very, very sharply from Washington to Tokyo to Berlin. Wherever new energy and climate change policies are being considered, there is a lot of opposition and a lot of struggling among different interests over the pace and nature of these kinds of changes. And in many situations, and I think Washington right now is a good example, you could argue that it would appear that the forces of the status quo are actually winning this epic battle. There have been successful efforts to block new legislation, to stop the rate of change, arguably even the breakdown of the Copenhagen negotiations in Denmark last December was an example of this very, very difficult political discussion that is going on both nationally and also internationally around the world. But interestingly, I think that it's also beginning to be true that many are recognizing, many within the industrial sector, indeed many within labor unions are beginning to recognize that in fact the creation of this new sustainable economic system, while it will involve costs, while it will involve difficult transitions, will also create thousands of new companies, millions of jobs, and really lay the foundation for a very exciting new economy in the future. And this battle between in effect the forces of today's economy versus those that are envisioning and beginning to build companies based on future structures is really one that is going to shape the pace and perhaps even the nature of the transformation that's coming towards us. The key, I think, is to begin really strategically thinking about the kind of transformation that's needed and to have the courage to admit that some industries need to die at the same time that others are born. And in fact, I believe that the kind of shift ahead will open up tremendous opportunities for those countries and indeed for those companies that are most able to put aside the businesses of the past, the economic models of the past, and really think towards the future, to think in a broad systems engineering kind of way, in a visionary way about a new kind of economy that can be created, and to develop the kind of coordinated strategy between governments and the private sector that is ultimately needed to guide this kind of a transition. And I think at stake are questions of international economic competitiveness, and that in fact what we will find in the end is that, unlike the argument that is made by many of today's large companies, that the real success stories of the future will be in those countries and those companies that take leadership and begin to forge these new kinds of industries for the future. One of the, I think, leading indicators of the kind of very rapid change that's coming is the dramatic growth in world carbon markets over the last 5 years. Between 2004 and 2009, the carbon markets grew from almost zero to over $140 billion a year. Carbon markets are companies mainly trading in order to allow themselves to meet national governmental limits on carbon emissions by trading from one company to another for the permits that allow them to emit carbon. The dominant markets in the world today are really in Europe, where there's a European Union carbon trading system in place that allows companies both to trade among themselves within the European Union and also to invest in projects in developing countries that allow emissions to be reduced in places like China and India and other parts of the world. You can see that these markets are just growing at an enormous rate, and given that there have yet to be carbon markets developed in any very significant way, either in North America or in Asia, you can see that the potential for this to grow in the future is very, very large. Now, I would argue that the absolute key to a sustainable global economy is going to be vastly increased levels of energy and resource productivity. This throwaway economy that I was describing earlier is enormously inefficient. Roughly 80% of the fossil fuels that we consume today are effectively turned into waste heat, or actually performing no useful work at all. And that has to be greatly improved if we are going to get to the kind of balance between the human economy and the natural resource system that we're ultimately going to require. Recent studies have suggested that the goal should be to strive for a factor 5 increase in energy and resource productivity over the next half century. To accomplish a revolution in energy and resource productivity that is equivalent to the great increase in labor productivity that marked the Industrial Revolution. So this really, I think, has to be central, and it is going to involve changes throughout the economy, whether you're talking about the manufacturing sector, the power industry, buildings. Almost everything in the economic system has energy and resource requirements and has great potential to improve energy and resource productivity. And I think the great challenge both for companies and for governments is going to be finding ways to use those resources much more cleverly in a much more efficient way, using this kind of systems engineering approach that I mentioned earlier. One of the other keys, of course, to a sustainable global economy is going to be to invest in new kinds of energy supplies, shifting from those fossil fuels that are either limited in quantity or that are facing atmospheric limits in terms of carbon dioxide, shifting from those fossil fuels to zero carbon energy sources, the renewables such as solar, wind, geothermal energy, bioenergy, and ultimately ocean energy as well. And you can see from this slide that, again, just since 2004, over the last 5 years, investment in these technologies has grown very rapidly, from only about $15 billion per year in 2004 up to nearly $120 billion in 2008, and likely exceeding $150 billion this year. This has become a very, very strong part of the energy sector. All of these non-hydro renewable energy sources only provide currently about 2% of the global electricity supply, but they are growing very, very rapidly. And I think that this slide illustrates some of the tremendous potential here and the great contrast between what's happening in the renewable energy technologies as compared to the traditional energy sources such as coal and oil and natural gas and even nuclear power. While oil is growing at 0.4% per year, 0.5% a year on average over the last 5 years, natural gas at 1.8%, nuclear actually shrinking at 0.5% per year, you can see that biofuels are growing at 23% per year, wind power at 27% per year, and solar energy at a remarkable 55% per year. These, of course, these new energy sources are starting from a rather small base. And I think there's a tendency in traditional energy sectors to sort of dismiss these new energy sources because they are relatively small. But I think just as what we saw happen in the information technology sector over the last 20 years, if you start even with a relatively small base in terms of market share, but grow at double-digit rates over periods of decades, you can go very, very quickly from being a small part of the market to being a very, very large part of the market. And you can see here the bottom line shows renewable energy, renewable power as a share of total global power generation. You can see that it is still well less than 5%. But as a share of new power generation added to the electricity grid, it is approaching 25% in 2008, and we believe that was close to 40% of the new power supply in 2009. And a recent report by McKinsey & Company, the leading economic consulting firm, projects that around the world these renewable technologies will dominate the market for new power equipment, having well over half of the market over the next decade. So the shape of the energy system is beginning to change very, very rapidly as the notion of a green economy begins to catch on in capitals around the globe. One of the really interesting new dynamics that has started to drive the development of government policy and started to drive the development of these new industries is the realization that lots of new economic opportunities and particularly new jobs can be created. And it's been sort of remarkable in the midst of this great recession that we've been in over the last couple of years that this motivation to create new green jobs has compelled many governments around the world to invest very substantially in these new industries as a way to create jobs that are being lost in automobiles and traditional manufacturing in many parts of the world, and has allowed, for the most part, these new energy technology industries to actually continue to grow quite substantially, even in the midst of these very, very difficult economic conditions. And the comparisons are really quite dramatic. $1 million invested in energy efficiency creates 21.5 new jobs compared to only 11.5 jobs for an equivalent investment in gas-fired power generation. Renewable energy has already created 3 million new jobs, most of them just in the last 5 years. Solar electricity creates 7 to 11 times more jobs per megawatt hour than coal or gas does. And retrofitting Europe's residential buildings to cut emissions 75% would create 2.5 million jobs by 2030. So we're seeing governments really respond to this quite dramatically. We see it at the state level in the United States. Many of our governors and many of our state legislatures are really competing among themselves to be the center of a green Silicon Valley in the future. And it remains to be seen whether it end up being California or Michigan or Ohio or other states, but it is already becoming a great sort of motivating political factor in the United States, as seen by the fact that when President Obama was running for election, hardly a week went by that he didn't stand in front of a solar factory or a wind turbine, a practice that he has actually continued since becoming president. Germany has really been a leader in creating these new green jobs, and particularly in the renewable energy sector. And you can see the growth between 2004 and 2008 alone, with Germany now having literally hundreds of thousands of jobs in the renewable energy sector, far more jobs than it has in the coal industry. And this is while still trailing behind the German automobile industry, of course, in terms of jobs, which is the largest single jobs-creating industry in the country. Renewable energy is, in fact, the fastest growing area of job creation in Germany, a model that I think other countries are going to be motivated to emulate in the years immediately ahead. But probably the largest area of job creation so far in the new green economy comes in the recycling process, which tends to be quite labor intensive. So you can see whether it be Brazil, which has already 500,000 jobs, or China, an estimated 10 million jobs in recycling, that this is becoming a really big and powerful engine of job creation, both in industrial and in developing countries around the globe. But of course, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg right now. If you compare the jobs in renewable energy in 2006 with what is projected to happen in 2030, it is expected that there could be at least 20 million additional jobs created just by 2030. And again, just in the renewable energy sector, which is only a fraction of the total green economy that is now being created in many nations. Let me now move to some analysis of what's going on in some individual countries, because of course here in Korea you face a question of how aggressively do you want to move into the creation of a green economy. And I think you can learn a lot of lessons by studying what has happened in the development of these new energy technologies and these new green economies in other parts of the world. Europe in general, but I think Germany even more specifically, has been the leader in creating a green economy throughout most of the 1990s and up through a large part of the last decade. It has been the world leader in installed renewable energy capacity, particularly growing the world's largest wind industry during the 1990s. It has adopted very strong carbon emission reduction targets, and it has developed a framework of national laws one of which is the highly effective feed-in tariff system that has helped to boost this very rapid growth in the renewable energy industry. But there are many, many other other laws and standards, from energy efficiency standards for automobiles and buildings to, of course, the carbon market itself, that have provided a strong government framework that has underpinned the investment by not only large companies like Siemens, for example, but also the growth of a whole new entrepreneurial sector of small and medium-sized companies that have allowed Germany to become not only the world leader, but also a major exporter of renewable energy technologies around the world. This graph shows the development of the renewable electricity industry in Germany, going from only about 4% of the national electricity supply in 1990 to about 16% of the total electricity supply today. Back in 1990, almost all of that came from hydropower. Hydropower really hasn't grown any since then, but you can see the rapid emergence of wind power, of bioenergy, the early emergence of the solar energy industry, and this was driven in large measure by this electricity feed-in tariff, which is a law that compels the electric utilities to buy the power generated from renewable energy at a price that's set by the government. And various versions of this law have been enacted by the German Parliament over time, even during periods when parties, when different political parties were in power. And while there have been many adjustments to the law over time, generally it has been gradually strengthened, and the industry has continued to grow. I think demonstrating very clearly the fact that it requires strong government policy frameworks to have successful new green economies, but also that without those kinds of policy measures, you're not going to see the kind of investment, the kind of development of new technologies that you would otherwise see. And interestingly, as Germany has become such a success story, other countries in Europe have begun successively to adopt similar framework policies, many of them actually modeled on the German policy. Spain was one of the first to develop these electricity feed-in tariffs, which were adopted originally about 10 years ago in Spain, and allowed a similarly rapid takeoff of the wind industry, of the solar industry. Spain has become a very big player, again, not only in terms of its domestic market, creation of jobs, but also creation of a number of important export markets. And so you find now, whether you're in South America or China or India or the United States, if you're looking at the wind business, you will almost always see German and Spanish companies and other European companies as well playing a very, very strong role. This is now spreading to other European countries as well. Italy, for example, is in the process of becoming a real leader. Sweden is another leader. The Netherlands. There is now broad growth across the European market as other countries respond to European Union directives, but also seek themselves to emulate the economic success that Germany and Spain have realized in this field. Now let me come to my country, to the United States. The United States was actually the leader in terms of both environmental policy, but also in the development of new energy technologies back in the 1980s. Unfortunately, we abandoned many of those policies when oil prices declined in the late 1980s and managed to drive almost all of the strong U.S. solar and wind companies out of business. And we were really basically out of the renewable energy business in the United States throughout most of the 1990s. But that has recently begun to change, as the United States has begun to respond to the need to, one, deal with some very serious environmental problems that we have, but also to develop these new economic opportunities that are really a needed part of the economic recovery. And once again, as was the case in the 1980s, California has been a real leader in terms of environmental and energy policy development. It actually has its own law to limit greenhouse gas emissions, is in the process of creating a statewide trading system, as are a number of other states. California is also reforming its electricity laws, both to encourage energy efficiency as well as to promote the development of renewable energy sources, and is investing very heavily in building some of the infrastructure of a green economy, including $75 million invested in green jobs training. And as a result of that, and similar initiatives that are being adopted in many other states, we've had a dramatic growth in the wind industry and increasingly in the solar industry in the United States, which is fortunate to have. While we've not had as strong a policy framework, we actually have a much stronger natural resource base of renewable resources, much stronger winds, much brighter sun. In fact, if you look at a solar map of Germany and the United States, and Germany is the world leader in the solar market, but if you compare the solar maps, the only part of the United States that has a solar resource comparable to that of Germany is Alaska. I mean, even the northeastern United States, let alone the southern and western states, have much, much stronger solar resources. So the opportunity is there to create a new kind of green economy in the United States. And I think finally, and perhaps more at the state level than at the federal level, we see signs that the U.S. is moving very actively into leadership position across many of these new industries, drawing on the tremendous strength that we have in all sorts of technologies, from material science to electronics to biotechnology, all of which are now being applied to the energy sector. And I think this graph sort of illustrates what's possible if you have good policy. Because one thing that California did successfully, even while it destroyed its renewable energy industries, it did have strong policies as well as higher electricity prices to promote more efficient use of energy. And you can see that electricity use per capita in California compared to the rest of the United States, while they were almost similar back in the 1960s, today California uses only half as much electricity per person as the rest of the United States. And a lot of that is a result of policy measures that encourage very high levels of efficiency. Similarly, if you look at carbon emissions per dollar of gross state product in the United States, you find that there is literally a 3-to-1 ratio between the most carbon-intensive state, Texas, and the least carbon-intensive state, which is New York. That's actually bigger than the difference between the United States and the European Union, and that results, again, mainly from the very different energy policies that are in place in different parts of the United States. Now, one of the things that the current U.S. administration has done that has had a real effect in terms of maintaining the momentum of the green economy was to step in with this economic stimulus program called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and to invest $71 billion of the $787 billion, so roughly 10% of the total, went into the green clean energy economy. $4.5 billion for upgrading energy efficiency in government buildings, $500 million for job training and efficiency in renewables, $2.5 billion for research on energy efficiency and renewable energy, $9.3 billion for investment in rail transportation, and $5 billion for home weatherization for low-income families. There also were $20 billion in clean energy tax incentives introduced, And again, this has accomplished really quite a remarkable thing, that this sector has continued to grow at double-digit rates, and in fact, we actually increased our installation of wind power by 30%. We now are installing 4 times as much wind power each year as Germany is, partly as a result of these very strong government incentives that have been put in place. What I think remains to be seen in the United States is whether we will be able to put in place the kind of sustained policy framework that has been so successfully adopted in Europe in order to sustain these kinds of industries over the long run. That is really, I think, the big challenge facing the United States, both at the federal and state level in the years immediately ahead. The really big story, though, in clean energy and in terms of building a green economy over the last 3 or 4 years has to be what has happened in China. What China has done has been absolutely astonishing in terms of going from being almost a non-player in these new green energy industries to literally now leading the world as of 2009 in terms of the small hydro industry, the solar water heating industry, the solar photovoltaic industry, and the wind power industry. The engine of leadership in the global renewable energy sector is clearly now in the process of shifting from European dominance led by Germany to Asian dominance led by China. $35 billion in clean energy investment in 2009 in China. That was roughly a 50% increase from the year before. Again, China put a very significant portion of its total government stimulus spending into the green economy and used that to again accelerate development despite a global recession. China is now literally the largest producer of wind turbines in the world, has many strong companies of its own, as well as having attracted a lot of international investment. Almost all of the major global wind players, companies like Vestas and General Electric and Siemens and so on, are investing in China. But China also has some of the leading companies in the world of its own, having really leapfrogged very quickly to a position of global dominance. And of course, China now has introduced strong goals not only for reducing the carbon intensity of its economy, but for improving energy efficiency and for rapidly increasing the share of renewable energy. This next slide shows the growth in solar photovoltaic production in recent years, and you can see China in yellow growing very quickly up through 2008, still behind Europe in 2008, but as I say, the numbers for 2009 indicate that China is now the global leader. Just this remarkable growth, now having substantially passed the United States, which actually invented this technology back in the 1950s, has rolled right past Japan, where you have the large electronics companies having invested heavily. Interestingly, in the case of China, the dominant companies are not the large electronics companies that dominate, for example, in Japan, but it is really new startup companies, in some cases companies that were not even around 5 years ago. So this is really the Silicon Valley economic model being transferred to China, which of course is a remarkable thing given that China is still largely a centrally planned economy in which the government plays a very large role. But I think China has shown the ability to have very strong and also very rapid change in government policies in a way that has stimulated private investment and has created a framework in which new technologies and new industries can be created. Really, I think creating a great deal of both surprise and envy on the part of many countries around the world who have a hard time even envisioning the pace of change that China has been able to accomplish in recent years. The other thing that I think is really critical and really world-changing about what has happened in China over these last few years is that because of China's ability to reduce the cost of manufacturing of almost any manufactured product, whether that be computers or automobiles, and the way in which in industry after industry it has lowered the cost of production, suggests that what China will do over the years immediately ahead is it will solve the biggest problem the renewable technologies face. They tend to be relatively expensive, relatively capital intensive to produce, and in order to compete effectively with fossil fuels and to ultimately replace fossil fuels in the global energy system, we are going to have to dramatically reduce the costs. And if there's one country in the world that is going to be able to help deliver the rapid decline in cost that is going to be needed to make renewable energy literally cheaper than fossil fuels, it is in fact China. Now let me conclude by talking a little bit about where things stand in Korea today and the opportunities that I think lie in front of you. Korea is a relatively latecomer to the green economy because, of course, South Korea has based its economic miracle of the last few decades on a very energy and resource-intensive manufacturing sector, has had great success in doing that. But, of course, this is the kind of economic model that I was suggesting earlier on is not going to be successful in the 21st century. And so Korea now faces the question of whether you are going to have a shift in direction and be able to successfully develop a new economic model rapidly in the way that China has begun to do in the last few years. And I would argue that there is really a lot of logic to Korea becoming a leader in this area. Korea is a country that has thrived not based on its abundance of natural resources, but really on the abundance of human skills, a very strong educational system, very strong technological capabilities, a country that is 97% dependent on imported energy, but which has the ability, without question, I think, to be a world-class leader in all of the kinds of technologies that are critical to a green economy. And this is, I think, what was recognized by your president just 2 years ago when he launched the low-carbon green growth strategy to begin developing a new green economy here in South Korea. And I think it is really quite remarkable the amount of policy change that has begun to come into place as a result of this new government leadership and what has been created just over the last year, including the fact that a world record high 78% of the economic stimulus spending that Korea has embarked on in the last year has gone into the kind of green industry development that other countries have begun to pursue as well. But a whole variety of national laws have begun to change, providing new incentives for energy efficiency, new standards, new kinds of investment vehicles, loan guarantees, a new renewable electricity standard and feed-in tariff system for the power sector, and a very ambitious national goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions 30% below the business-as-usual projection by 2020. So there is now in place a very, I think, robust by international standards set of economic policy measures that really hold out the potential for Korea to begin to transform its economy over the years immediately ahead. Now, it's far too early to know what the results of all of these new government initiatives will be, but I must say that I've been very impressed by the kind of leadership that has already been shown by some of the leading Korean companies. Companies like Samsung have begun to invest very heavily in wind and solar technology. And there's also starting to be a lot of entrepreneurial development, venture capital investment, new companies being created. And I think the early signs that Korea is having the kind of both vision and political leadership, and also the kind of partnership between government and industry that are ultimately going to be needed in order to create this kind of new green economy. Now, I have no doubt that there will be challenges ahead. Inevitably, as in my country, there will be certain parts of the economic sector that will resist the kind of change that's needed. But I must say that based on the change I see around me here in Korea and the kinds of very positive conversations I've had with many people since I've been in your country, I'm very optimistic that when I come back next time to Korea, hopefully next year, we will be able to say without question that China is now becoming one of the leaders of the new green economy. Thank you all very much.